This is the second video lecture on the topic of young adulthood or emerging adulthood. In the previous one, we kind of ended up in the middle of a topic, ended talking about stress. And the reason we're discussing stress in this particular chapter is because this is really lots of stuff's going on. It's a potentially stressful time. And so the previous lecture video, I was talking about kind of what we mean by stress and the different types versus acute versus chronic. I want to start this topic or this lecture discussing about how to cope with stress, right? Because that's really the key. We can't live a life, we probably wouldn't want to live a life where there was no stress, but we have to figure out how to make it work to our advantage and how to use it, right? Or how to cope with it, how to manage it. So one of the key things to think about, and I think I kind of mentioned this in the last one, is that stress is really kind of in our head. It's about how we perceive things that are happening to us. And this book talks about the difference between primary appraisal versus secondary appraisal. Well, and how both of them, really what we're saying is how we interpret what's happening. Is it good? Is it bad? Do I have the resources to cope with it, right? And that will determine in how stressful something is. Temperament. Now, temperament's important going way back. So this is why it's important to know, to understand the concept, but also to know what your temperament is. So going way back in one of the earlier chapters where we were discussing children, right? And how if children adapt well to changes in the environment, right? That they're easier to soothe. So children that were easier to calm down were said to have an easy temperament versus a difficult or a slow to warm up temperament. So the question is, what is yours? What is your temperament? Do you cope well with change? Do you not like change? All of these things play into how you are going to perceive, how you're going to handle stress. But what's also important is what kind of stressor is it? Because again, a new job, and it could be your dream job, is a kind of stressor. It's a good stressor. Graduating from college, that's stressful, but it's a good stress. Is it something that you can control, right? Is it something that you choose, or is it something that's happening to you? Maybe like a natural disaster or someone is dying, right? Is it ambiguous or clear? In other words, do you know? Is it you just found something out, like you're sick, but you don't know what it is? Do you know what you're dealing with? Do you not know what you're dealing with? Is it something that's going to take a long time to work out, or is it something that's just a one and done kind of thing, right? So I think in this chapter, yes, it is in this chapter, or in this chapter, I have an assessment that asks you about coping. And there's different ways that we deal with coping, right? And knowing what your go-to strategy is also important. So we have something called emotional focused coping and something called problem focused coping. So let me start with problem focus. This one right here. Problem focus is when we deal with a situation by fixing it. Right? So sometimes men are often more likely to be a problem-focused coping. So you're talking to your male partner about a problem, and they just want to fix it for you, or they start offering you solutions, or maybe you have a mother like this, right? Where you call her up and you're complaining and your mom just starts offering solutions. And for me, at least, I would get very frustrated with my mother, and I would say, I just want to talk to you because my mother was trying to solve my problem. Her strategy with stress was to fix the problem, to make it go away. And this works for some things, right? This works for situations like you have a whole lot to do on your to-do list. You have to study for a test. You got to buy a birthday present for your kid's friend, and you have laundry to do. You make a list and you go through it, right? You check it off. That's problem focused. But sometimes things are happening in your life that you can't fix. A natural disaster, someone is sick. Trying to think of some other, those are really the best examples. And it would be unhealthy or maybe even illogical for you to try to solve that problem because it's not a problem you can solve. And so in that case, we focus on how we feel. And that's what we call emotional coping. So again, going back to previous conversations where we've talked about emotions, or going back to what we've discussed in Intro to Psych about how emotions are they're really mind activities, right? How emotions require a cognitive appraisal of something and how we interpret what's happening, and then the how we emote. So emotional coping is when we think about things different so we can have a different feeling or a different emotional reaction, right? When we reinterpret things. So my mom uses emotional coping when instead of things being like a crisis, right? It's an adventure, and she'll reinterpret things that happen to her. A friend of mine was concerned that there was a reason to believe that her unborn grandchild might have Down syndrome. And her immediate response was, oh, well, we don't have one of those in our family. We don't have somebody. That'll be diversity. That'll make our family more rich. That is an emotional coping response. Instead of it being, oh my God, this is just terrible, right? She thought about it different. She can't fix it, right? So she thinks about it different, and that's how we deal. So those are the two. What's referred to as defensive coping. Now, this is one you don't really want to do because it's not terribly functional. And that's when you just deny it, or you distort it, right? Or you ignore it. And that's not helpful. That's not helpful. And in fact, there'll be more long-term consequences of that approach. And then emotional insulation, what's that one? Unconsciously try to prevent. So that's another kind of denial. That's simply where you refuse to feel, right? Or you resist. Sometimes when we're dealing with grief, people will simply not go there. And what we learn in psychotherapy, what the research says is that we must go through these emotional experiences. That's really the healthier, and I say healthy with air quotes, because again, that's even a social construct, right? What's considered healthy. But people who allow themselves to feel and allow themselves to process and accept their feelings, they do seem to do better. They do seem to have better overall well-being, right? They're more satisfied with their life than people who deny emotions. Heartiness, and again, I don't remember, I used to have a heartiness scale in this chapter. I'm not sure if it's still there. Heartiness refers to all kinds of different characteristics that enable us to cope. Right. So some people, and there is some evidence that this might be a genetic thing. Some people simply seem to be more resilient. They seem to have the emotional, the cognitive, the social resources to deal with more stressors. So heartiness, oh, you know what? I think it is. Heartiness scale asks you to consider, it is what we call commitment to self, which means do you have your own sense of what is important to you? Commitment to self. One is, do you perceive life as an adventure or a challenge? So when we think of life as a challenge and that life is hard, we're going to be less hardy. We're going to be less resilient. When we think of life as a challenge, something that we can learn from, or a new thing that we're trying to do, right? Then we deal with stress better. And the third one, I forget what the third one is. Okay, so I'm just going to stop right here. And then when I come in the next video, I want to talk about what's going on in our intellectual development in these early stages of life.